If you've ever tried to make any type of change in your life, you know how difficult it is. Change is not simple. Maybe you want to lose weight, and so you go onto a diet, and you find that there's that seesaw pattern of losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight. Maybe for other people there are addictions that they're trying to overcome. Maybe it's smoking or an alcohol or other type of addiction. And for many people, they find that breaking those habits takes an incredible amount of willpower and is often a struggle. We know even from our own experience that when we make New Year's resolutions, that making them, we can make them quite easily and we can start to establish patterns and habits. But after a couple weeks, we find we've fallen back into our old ways. And the routines and the changes that we started off with are gone. We can have a lot of will, desiring to change, a lot of wanting to change, but when it comes to willpower, we find that what's lacking is the power in the will. That we realize that our will is incredibly weak. And so we can resolve, we can decide, we can choose, we can make all sorts of plans and efforts, and yet we find that deep within us there are struggles and problems and challenges that are so far embedded into us that it's actually incredibly difficult to weed out those things that are in us. Habits, anger, bitterness, jealousy, trying to cope in inappropriate ways. And when we're trying to deal with those things and we're trying to root them out, what we discover is that the roots are so tangled into our soul that it's incredibly hard for us to get them out. And what we need is a vision of who God sees us. We need a vision of what God's plan is for us. We need a vision of something greater so that we can have a hope. Because if it depends upon my ability, my strength, my willpower, I'm going to fall over and over again back into my old ways. But if God would give us a greater vision of His glory and goodness for us, of a glorious future that awaits for us, a glorious hope, a glorious transformation, then we know that there is hope to change. And the reason we can have hope to change is because the Apostle Paul even says this in 2 Corinthians 3. He says that we are being changed from one degree of glory to another. And it's glory that changes us. It's the way that glory comes and meets us. When the disciples see Jesus in Luke here, in Luke 9, with this transformation, this transfiguration, the elevation of glory, the exaltation of glory that's displayed to him, it doesn't immediately look like something profound has happened to them, and yet this results in tremendous change. This is the greatest moment that the disciples will experience. They've seen miracles, they've heard Jesus' great teaching, but in terms of all of Jesus' ministry before His death and resurrection and ascension, this is the moment where glory is displayed most clearly, where it captured the imagination of His disciples, and it produced in them an understanding of how you change. So what brought about change for Jesus' disciples? And what is the change that will come about for you and me? 3 things that I want us to see from Luke chapter 9 this morning. And the first thing I want us to see is that if we are going to change, we need to first trust God to do a new thing. We see this in verse 28, where it says, "Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took," that's being Jesus, "he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray." And we read a verse like that, and what we discover is that there are a lot of details in there. There's a lot of details that we take and we assume that are just part of the natural discourse of telling a story. There's the detail of after 8 days. After 8 days, Jesus had taught His disciples many things about what it means to follow Christ, what it means to be a disciple of His. And He had told them to take up their cross daily and follow Him. And 8 days later, then He takes them up onto the mountain and He goes to pray. But when the gospel writers give us details that are so specific, it should cause us to stop for a moment and say, why this specific detail? Why 8 days? Why mention 8 days? Why not just say about a week later? Why specify these things? And I want to suggest to you there's two reasons. First, it is historical, and second, it's theological. It's historical because most accurately, this is portraying what happened over 8 days. But after those 8 days, we're also being signaled into something that is greater and more grand. Because in the Bible, the 8th day has to do with something that God is going to do that's new. On the first day, or in the first week of creation, God makes the heavens and the earth and everything in 6 days. On the 7th day, he rests and he invites humanity into his Sabbath rest. But it is on that day that his own people fall into sin. And so it's on the 8th day that God goes and he offers a sacrifice for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And as a result of that, it becomes this paradigm that the 8th day is a day of a reminder of God's redeeming work. We know that that's the case because when the Jews would then celebrate the birth of a new child, a new male child, and this lovely creation, they would perform this act of circumcision on the 8th day. A sign of belonging to the covenant, a sign of belonging to God's very own people. And as a result of that, it was the promise that God was redeeming a people, a chosen people for himself, who would be his new creation in the world. And so when Luke says something like, on the 8th day, it ought to signal to us that we are to expect that God is going to do something brand new, something that has not been seen before. Not only does Luke tell us that it was on the 8th day that Jesus went up to the mountain, he takes 3 of his disciples, this close inner circle. He takes Peter, James, and John. As he takes those 3 disciples and he goes up, we're told they went up onto the mountain, and we're told specifically what they were there to do. They went to pray. Anytime that Jesus prays in the Gospel of Luke, something significant happens after that. It's like prayer becomes this pivotal moment. That prayer actually is the moment where something then significant will follow that. And Jesus has this pattern in his ministry whereby when he prays, something significant happens. And what this means then is that we need to understand what it is that Jesus is doing in this mountaintop experience. We'll come back to that detail about being on the mountain in a few minutes. But first, what I want us to think about is, what is prayer? When we think about what prayer is, don't we often have this attitude that prayer is just me bringing my list of needs before God? Yes, sure, I should bring some adoration, but really it's I have all these needs. But when we truly understand what prayer is, it is us opening up ourselves to God and his glory. It's us opening up ourselves in all of our weaknesses, in all of our failures, in all of the things that we have failed to do. It's seeing God for who he is and allowing us to be exposed for who we really are. It's more than just bringing a prayer list. It's about being exposed to glory. It's exposing ourselves to glory, believing that because we have trusted in Christ, he can do a new thing in us. And so by opening ourselves up in prayer, as we expose ourselves to the glorious God who is making all things new, we are by our very own confession in prayer saying, Lord, I need you to make me new. So Jesus takes his disciples up onto the mountain to pray, and this is a display of something that is going to be new. We have to trust God to change us, because change begins with going to God in prayer and exposing our true lives before him and his glory. And as we do that, and as we trust that God is going to do a new thing, the second thing I want us to see is that as we trust him to do a new thing, we want to, number 2, look for glory, or look to glory. When we're told in verse 29, as Jesus was praying, Luke tells us that his appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, to which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now here, in this moment of prayer, as Jesus brings himself before his Father and he exposes himself into his Father's glory, his face is altered, we're told. That his face has this shining illumination to it, and his clothes become radiant. And when we think about this, in all of this glory in terms of what is happening right at this moment, that Jesus' clothing becomes illuminant and his face is altered, this ought to bring back to our minds the things that have happened in the Old Testament. That throughout the Old Testament, we had found that there were key figures who had come before the Lord and who were coming to seek him. Moses, for example, had come before God in Exodus 33 after Israel had fallen into sin, and he was pleading with God for them and God to show Moses, show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will let all of my goodness pass before you, but it will not be my face. And the Lord covers him as he goes by, just so that he can see the back of the train of his robe. Or we think of Isaiah in the temple offering a sacrifice upon the altar. And as he's offering it there, the Temple Mount is shaken by an earthquake. And the glory of the Lord appears. And all of this glory is there. And what does Isaiah see? He doesn't see the face of God. He sees the very tip of the back of the train of his robe. And he's overcome. God had said that you cannot see my face and live. But now, the face of God is illuminated in glory. And the disciples live. They're experiencing something that Moses did not, that Isaiah did not. And as the disciples are there and as they watch Jesus being transformed, being transfigured before them, along comes two figures, two men, Moses and Elijah. Moses is the man of God who had led his people, the Lord's people, out of the bondage of Egypt, out of slavery, out of oppression, across the Red Sea, brought them to the mountain of Sinai, received the law, taught them the law, took them into the wilderness where they were provided by God, and they saw God's glory on display at the tabernacle. Moses was that figure who gave the people the law. This is why the first 5 books of the Bible are called the book of Moses. It's the book of the law. It's the giving of the law. That all that Moses represents is the law. All of what God had revealed from Genesis to Deuteronomy in the law. Moses now stands there as a representation. And the second figure that's there is Elijah. Elijah, who represents all the prophets of the Old Testament, who spoke about the law and how Israel would receive blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience, and how they needed as a people to follow God. And so Elijah stands there, and he is one who represents all of the prophets in all of what God has spoken. Moses is that one, as I said, who led the people away from the slavery of Pharaoh, out of the house of bondage, took them across the Red Sea, saw God's deliverance when the sea crashed down on the Egyptians and crashed on their chariots. How they were led to Mount Sinai, where God's glory descended upon the top of the mountain, and Moses received the law. And they took that and they put that law into a tabernacle where God's glory again descended in all of its great display. And Elijah, who when confronting the idolatry, just like Moses had confronted the idolatry when Israel had worshipped a golden calf, so Elijah confronted the idolatry of his day and of his age. And he had confronted it with the power of God, the confrontation at Mount Carmel against the prophets of Baal. And hoping and praying that there would be a renewal and revival, Elijah sought to seek out the good for Israel, but only to discover that the heart of the king was so against the Lord that he had to flee, and he had to flee all the way back to Mount Sinai. And in both instances, for Moses and for Elijah, Moses had come before God and he had said, "Show me your glory." And the Lord put him in a cleft of a rock and covered his face. And he passed by and said, the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." And Moses saw glory. And Elijah, after thinking and hoping and praying that there would be revival, he runs in 1 Kings 19 all the way back to Mount Sinai, where we're told he goes into the cave. That same spot where Moses had been placed in the cleft of the rock, but this time there's no thunder and lightning. There's an earthquake, there's a whirlwind, but God's glory is on display. How? In a still, small voice. And here are these two figures who have experienced glory before. A glory so great that it's almost incomparable in the rest of the Old Testament. And there we're told in verse 30 and 31, they appeared with Jesus and they are having one of the most profound theological conversations in the entire Bible, it says. They were talking with him about his, now most of our Bibles say departure, but you'll notice that there's a footnote there. If you have the English Standard Version, there's a footnote that on that word departure. And if you look down below, and when I read it, you heard me say Exodus. Because it's exactly that Greek word. It's the Greek word for Exodus. That they were talking with Jesus, Moses, and Elijah about his Exodus. Moses, the one who had experienced the first true great Exodus, he's talking with Jesus about a second, greater, more glorious Exodus. And Elijah, who was longing for the people to be delivered out of the bondage of slavery and idolatry and looking for that future Exodus, now they talk with Jesus about an Exodus. And we know the details about what this Exodus is going to involve, because we're told that as they were talking with him about his departure, it was about to take place and be accomplished at Jerusalem. In other words, what Luke is telling us is that the Exodus that Jesus is about to perform is going to happen by his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. That he's going to lead his people out of the bondage, not of Egypt, but out of the bondage of sin and death. That he is going to taste the wrath of God. And by tasting the wrath of God for sinners, he will take that wrath, he will receive that punishment, and he will taste the curse of death for them so that they can know life. And that he can bring them out to the promised land of glory. And so just as Moses and Elijah had experienced in taste and in part a little bit of Exodus, now they see Jesus, who's come to display all of the glory of a new Exodus, to take his people to the promised land that he has. And the way then that we can have confidence that we can change is that we get a sense that if it's only up to me, I can't change. But if there's someone who has tasted sin and death, who's not yet succumbed to the sin, who has resisted temptation, if he has tasted death for us, and he has taken the curse away, and he shows us that there is a future glory by being illuminated, his face being altered, his clothes being shining bright, then doesn't that mean that there's a hope for you and me? Doesn't that mean that there is the possibility that you can change and that I can change? That we're not actually as stuck. Even though sin has wormed its way in and the roots are so deeply entangled in our souls, there's actually a hope. That your struggle with anger or bitterness or unforgiveness, that your bad habits that you just can't seem to break, that they actually can be broken. Why? Because there's been one who has come to accomplish this for you, and he has given you a vision of glory. That what your vision ought to be is about a glorious future, that God is changing you from one degree of glory to another, and because he is changing you from one degree of glory to another, that the Transfiguration is a display that change is possible. You see, all of the gospel writers, they put the context of the Transfiguration in a section on discipleship. That's why I read verses 23 to 27 beforehand. It's about losing your life and finding that if you pick up your cross daily and follow Jesus, He will transform you. But you have to have the knowledge that there is a glory that will change you, that it's not about willpower, that it's about Christ's power. And when we have that confidence, then we can be as disciples who live as those who can trust God that He will change us and that He will bring about a change. So we look to glory and we trust God because those who trust Christ will be changed. So we trust God for new things. We look to glory. And the third thing is we reject traditionalism. In this, we're told that when Peter, who suddenly comes from the doldrums of sleep, this is what the disciples do so well. They have mastered napping. And as they all wake up from their slumber, they look and they notice Jesus in all of this radiant glory, and they see Elijah and Moses there with him. And what does Peter respond by to all of this? Verse 32, now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they had came fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 tents, one for you, Moses, and Elijah, not knowing what he had said. Now, we might wonder what on earth causes Peter to think I should build 3 tents. Because we typically just think of tents in terms of pitching a tent and camping. We have to remember that we've been coming through the story of the Bible and that tents are a reminder of Israel in the wilderness, of their own Exodus experience, and that the way that they remembered the glory of God on Sinai, that just as God had descended with glory on Sinai, as He had shown all of His greatness and power, Israel remembered that experience by recreating it in the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was the tent where they met God in all of His glory. And so for Peter, what he's saying is, let's build 3 tabernacles, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah, because if we could just capture this sense of glory, if we could just hang on to this sense of glory, then maybe we could remember all the things that have happened, and that we could remember this great moment, and that we could be changed, that we could come back to it. And humans are notorious for wanting to capture glory and try and hang on to it and think that we can change by grasping onto things. And so we've had these great mountaintop experiences where we've encountered the glory of God. Maybe it was at a youth retreat. Maybe it was at a conference. Maybe it was some event in our lives. We just experienced God in a profound way. And what happens when we come back to Sunday mornings? Oh, these poor people, if only they could have a taste of glory like I've had. And we want to bring our experience to bear on other people. We think that if I could capture it, program it, systematize it, that somehow, if I could bring back this sense of glory that I experienced, that maybe there'd be transformation too. And so we want to make things more fun and more exciting, like that youth conference and that event that we had that mountaintop experience. But here's the thing. We don't capture glory. Glory captures us. When glory grabs you, you're not able to control it. You can't take glory and stick it back into a bottle like a genie that you can rub it and it'll reappear and it'll grant your 3 wishes the next time. What we need are fresh encounters of the glory of God. What we need are these fresh experiences of God's revealing glory. What we need is the sense that when God comes and reveals glory, it changes us. And for the disciples, this would be the first event, but it would lead them to understand what the cross and resurrection would be all about, so that afterwards they would change from one degree of glory to another, as Paul would say. And we want to capture this glory. We want to recreate experience. But what we need is that we need to worship the glorious Christ. And this is what all of the gospel stories are pointing us to, is to worship Christ in all of His glory. As Moses and Elijah disappear into the cloud, that cloud of glory that had led Israel through the wilderness, that cloud of glory that had descended on the tabernacle and the temple, that cloud of glory of God being showing up on display, as Peter and James and John see these two men disappear into the cloud of glory, there's a voice that speaks, we're told, in verse 35. And it speaks from the cloud, and it says three things. This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. And every single phrase is packed with such critical importance for us to understand what it means to change. First, this is my son. What Jesus hears and what the disciples hear is an affirmation of who Jesus is in his status, not only as the son who is fully God, but also as the true son. That Adam, who was the son of God, who experienced all the blessings of being with God, failed. That responsibility then was given to Israel, who was called in Exodus 4:22, my firstborn son. My firstborn son, who was given all of the blessings and promises of redemption and salvation, yet who failed. And along comes the true son. The son who, as we hear from Psalm 2, as Pastor Gary read this morning, this is my son. He'll receive an inheritance. Ask of me, and I'll give you the nations. David, who had been promised a son who would sit on his throne forever and rule and reign. Now this son comes to receive for himself a bride to purify his inheritance, an inheritance of nations. And that means that if he is not just a son, but he's a kingly son, who rules over nations, who receives his bride as an inheritance, it means that he's working for our change. So the words, "This is my son," are words of affirmation of the change that God can bring to you as the children of God. The second phrase, "This is my son, my chosen one," which takes us back to Isaiah 42. Isaiah would say, "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit on him. He will bring forth justice to the nations." Here we hear the voice of heaven affirming that this is the chosen one, the servant that God had chosen to bring about the redemption of Israel. And this chosen one then would not only come to bring justice to the nations, but we are told in Isaiah 52, verses 13 to the end of chapter 53 of Isaiah, that he would be a suffering servant, despised and rejected by many, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, one from whom men would hide their faces, and we would not esteem him. But he would take up our sorrows and our afflictions, and we, like sheep who had gone astray and fallen into sin, the Lord had laid upon him the iniquity of us all. And being the chosen one means that he experiences all of the wrath of heaven for you and me, so that he tastes death so that we might taste life. And for him to be the chosen one, it means that all of the curse that could stand between you and God, that would prevent you from change, has been crucified at the cross. It's been dealt with. It's been addressed. And the last thing, not only is he the son, the chosen one, but he is the one whom we hear the voice of heaven say, "Listen to him." And these words remind us of what Moses had prophesied in Deuteronomy 18. That there would come one who would be after him, a prophet, who would speak the word of the Lord. And in Deuteronomy 18:18, we're told, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him." And along comes this one who has the very words of God in his mouth. And he speaks those living words so that you and I would know the hope that there is to change. But you might say, "That's great, Andrew, but I'd really like that glory experience. I'd really like to have that mountaintop experience for myself, because I feel really stuck and I'd really like to change. And you know what Peter says to us? In 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter recounts his experience on the Mount of Transfiguration. And as he recounts that experience, he says these words in 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning at verse 16. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased," we ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on that holy mountain. Now Peter is saying, I was there. I was at the Mount of Transfiguration. I experienced the glory that was there. And then this is what he says to us. Verse 19, and we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you will do well to pay attention, as a lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning stars arises in your hearts. And what Peter is saying to us then is simply this. You want to have an experience of glory? It's happening right now. There is more glory present here than at the Mount of Transfiguration. Do you believe that? Anytime you open up this book, glory, more glory than what came down at Sinai, than what came down at the Mount of Transfiguration is happening. That this is a dangerous book because when it is opened, when it is read, when we trust and believe it, when we hear the voice of heaven, we are exposed to glory. And we will be changed. 1 degree, one little bit, by a little bit, by a little bit, by a little bit. And this is what Peter says, that we have received this prophetic word. It's a sure word. And so what should we do? We should listen to Jesus. We should hear his voice. The voice that thundered over Sinai, the voice that showed up in glory, the voice that spoke from the cloud is the voice that speaks Sunday after Sunday, devotional time after devotional time. It is glory after glory after glory. It is greater. So listen to Jesus. Pick up your cross and go to him and see him and find that there is glory there.